It's all here. Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, excellent job of fixing the air conditioning
We've-
over the break, and we've now got a southerly coming into the apartment.
They've done a very good job, haven't they, fixing the air conditioning?
So they've gone up the climate as well.
Fix the ozone.
Turn off the middle one.
Fix the ozone layer. Okay. Right. Thank you, everyone, for enjoying that lunch. And we are now back to item 15, page 53, the HBRIC Ltd update. And a moment to introduce Dr. Pearce and Mr. Newman. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, councillors. This report has several elements, and we'll take turns at covering them. So the first element is the strategic plan, and we had a preliminary discussion with you a couple of meetings ago, I think, where we suggested kind of a several-step process, which is set out at the beginning here, develop investment principles being the first. And so this paper on the first page sets out our proposition of what those investment principles might look like, and we're seeking your feedback on those. I don't know whether you want to progress a discussion about that right now, Chairman, or whether you simply want to receive this and have a response in writing, but I'm happy in
I think some
outcomes.
feedback would be useful now.
Yes.
Yeah. So how do you want to go right through this report, or should we just do it?
No, I think we should take it a chunk at a time. If
Chunk
that's
at a
all right
time,
with you.
okay. So the first part there, everyone is around this Hawke's Bay HBRIC Ltd strategic plan. Are there any views or questions in regard to that? Councillor Bevan, did you have a...
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I had some difficulty with this because under normal circumstances, an investment company that's a subsidiary of an entity would be charged with the task of investigating in investment options and bringing them to the parent to discuss. However, in this particular case, what we're looking at is a council that has a long-term planning process and a 10-year plan in place, and anything that falls outside of that, I'm not convinced that we've got the process right. We're going to end up with a beast with several heads, it seems to me, and I'm not quite sure how what you're proposing would fit in with the council's own long-term planning process.
So I agree that there's potentially an issue there, but I would remind you that as council, you asked us to develop a strategic plan. There is, in our statement of intent, a proposal to do so. And as I said, we sought your agreement to this kind of three-stage process. So there might need to be a principle, if you like, that nothing in the strategy can be inconsistent with what's in Council's 10-year plan at its triennial review. That might be a way of dealing with the concern that you raise.
Councillor
Question
Barker.
to Chair. I think clarity about the process that's being undertaken here would help the conversation. I think the conversation would be a little more challenging if we were expected today to adopt it rather than receive the plan, have some discussion about it, and then for Council to come back to HBRIC later with a considered view on the plan. I think that would be the process I would prefer.
I think that's what we're looking at here, isn't it? Is that...
So I think that's essentially what we're asking
Sure.
for.
Sure, good. Just as long as we're clear on that.
What I wouldn't want to be is in a position where, having posited these fairly high-level principles to you, that we then go away and do something that is more specific and then come back and find that those are inconsistent with what you would think would be a good set of principles. But they are only principles at this stage, and your feedback on those principles to guide a more detailed strategy, I believe, would be helpful to both you and to us.
So on that basis, are there any other questions or thoughts on this particular piece?
Is there any violent objection, I guess, an initial first blush to these 5 propositions?
Councillor Dick.
I'm happy with the 5 principles at this point, and it's nice to see they only take up half a page.
We'll try to follow that guidance in future with the rest of the document.
Councillor Pipe.
Andy, can you just flesh out a little bit principle number 3 for me, just to get my head around it?
So it's kind of it's an issue that I think the council will have to address in relation to the port. Obviously, the port is growing rapidly. It needs significant capital investment. It is, as it takes on larger and larger contracts, including contracts from outside the region, it will expose itself to more substantial and more lumpy risk. And so the question for council, I think, is do you want to wear the downside risk of that as well as having the upside benefits? We don't have a particularly strong view about that at the moment. It's a matter that needs to be tested and drawn out in the development of this strategy.
Could I respond to you on that and say that I think the principle 3 tilts it in a direction for me that says reduce, which seems to then imply reduce the ownership, etc., to reduce the risk. I would have preferred a more neutral risk.
So can I suggest a more neutral form might be then to evaluate the risks and benefits of 100% ownership versus sharing with other investors?
Well, as long as, if you say, provide advice to the council on the risk of, ownership of assets, simple as that. You provide the advice. Whether we take it or not is another thing, but it doesn't show any predisposition to a particular outcome.
That's fine. We're happy to take that on board.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Belford had his hand up.
Two questions, I guess. One is, what is the pot, I guess, of assets that would be looked at in this context? There are some that are presently being held here at the council in various forms, and then there's the port and monies committed theoretically to the dam. So is there a quantum, or is there some, I assume this would ultimately come down to indicating some priorities or potential choices amongst investments or what have you. So is there a pot that's being kind of focused on? Or?
So the pot, as you put it, that we would currently be focusing on is the set of assets that HBRIC has, because it's council's strategy in the end to decide whether out of the other assets that it has, whether it wants to place those into HBRIC or not. That might be a logical outcome, or a discussion around that might be a logical outcome of us preparing a plan, but I wouldn't want to, again, be in a position of presuming and advising you about things that are not in HBRIC's portfolio at the present time.
So if that further transfer were not to occur, what assets would there be to be planning against other than potentially freeing monies from port ownership?
Well, that's one obvious source of, and as one of these principles says, to consider the prospect of taking some of the funds out of a single investment and diversifying that amongst others, which are within this set of principles.
But what other sources of funds would there be?
There would be debt, for example.
Okay.
Because currently we have a completely unleveraged balance sheet.
Okay. Yeah, and can you put a number, attach a number to that? I mean, is there any limit to what kind of borrowing could occur, or what?
At this point, no.
Okay. All right. My other question had to do with number 5, I guess, which seemed to me to tilt this very much in the direction of looking at the primary sector only and various opportunities around the primary sector, supply chains connected to that and so forth. Would there be any interest in looking at other kinds of investments that might put us on a path toward more diversification?
Well, if you could suggest, because it's 5th in a series of 5 which focus on infrastructure, if there are suggestions of other infrastructure assets that might be focused on by us, then obviously we'd be interested to hear about those. But the obvious infrastructure assets of the electricity lines network, for example, or the ultra-fast broadband network or other broadband networks are already in the hands of other parties. But if there are suggestions that you wanted to make about areas that we could examine under this, by all means, we'd like to hear about them.
Could I have a follow-up to that? I think you touched on an issue that I'm interested in, and that is that the balance sheet of Hawke's Bay is actually very strong. There's lots of assets here, but they're scattered across a number of balance sheets. I was wondering if there's an opportunity for HBRIC to lead a conversation with other territorial authorities, Hawke's Bay Power Trust, to find a commercial vehicle which could pool those assets onto a single balance sheet and therefore gain leverage for the region. So we're only talking about in this about what's within our provenance, but I think it would be a useful conversation which I think HBRIC could lead, to have a discussion with Hastings, Napier, etc., the Power Trust, to say, well, let's talk about Hawke's Bay. What is it we can share without them giving away their ownership, put onto a single balance sheet, or collate them so that we can gain leverage and benefit out of it?
I'd be willing to undertake such a discussion, but with some precursor engagement between the chair of this council, the respective mayors, and so on and so forth. And I think it would be highly presumptuous of HBRIC to commence such a conversation, entirely on its own.
Well, I would like you to consider having an innocuous number 6 there, that should the chair and other people think it's worthwhile, it gives you the opportunity to have the conversation.
Yep, that's fine. We'll do that. If enabled by other parties.
Exactly.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Andy, what's a triple bottom line value?
So environmental, economic and social.
Oh, okay.
Right, continue, please.
So I'm going to hand over to Andrew to deal with the next part of the paper, which is responding to some questions from councillors around, at a high level, around the water user agreement and the conditionalities that are set out in that agreement.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. So this is the Foundation Water Use Agreements in the public domain. It's well circulated amongst various parties, including those who are contracting. And what we've done here is simply outlined the key conditionality elements in it and the rationale for those, and broadly just identified what it means really. So I'm happy to run through those in any amount of detail required, or take questions. So, Chairman, I'm happy to be guided by you on that, really.
Okay, well,
Or do you want me to go through it?
just quickly run through it.
Yeah.
And we'll get it.
Yep. Okay. So the first one there, conditional clauses. Clearly there's conditionality around the agreement, water user agreement, on the scheme proceeding. That's a bit of a no-brainer. If it doesn't proceed, then the agreement's null and void. Second, B, that's a B, the scheme proceeds but elects not to deliver water to a water user's delivery point. So that's reasonably straightforward as well. Somebody says there's a financial and economic calculation that says pipe to X, sufficient water demand, is that affordable and in the overall capital construction envelope? So that's an element of conditionality, and actually in the schemes at HBRIC's favour at this point. And obviously it doesn't achieve financial close, and we've put a sort of a termination date of 30 June 2016 on that. So we've left a window in that part of the agreement. Next point here is relief for inability to...
What's
Yep.
the difference between that date as a financial close and the March 2015
Well,
date as a financial
March is, as you'll be aware, is our best estimate of when we could close this deal, assuming the conditions are met, and that includes effectively an uncontested consenting regime. So we can't guarantee what the outcome from the High Court will be. Nobody can do that, and nobody can absolutely predict what avenue various parties may or may not take depending on that outcome. So what we've done is forecast what we believe is an achievable financial close date, subject to getting effectively an uncontested consent. But in these agreements, we've left a window for their execution. That's what that means.
But so that is not a reference to the date that we have currently agreed
No, it's
to
not.
as the financial close?
No, it's not.
No, it's a date by which these documents would have to be exercised.
That's right.
Can we just, we'll go through to the end of this and then
Yep.
save your questions, please.
So the second one here is inability to agree farm environmental management plans, FEMPs, on regulatory grounds. I'll come back to that and discuss that in a wee bit of detail. Third there is what we call a deferred indexation clause. So it's effectively an incentive-based discussion between ourselves and water users. For example, if in principle the water use agreements reach a threshold of 60 million cubic metres contracted, then what that enables us to do within reason, subject to some more financial modelling and assessment of those agreements in detail, is effectively defer the inflation clause to the point of water delivery. But if, for example, the uptake number is around 40 million cubic metres, for example, and the scheme goes, then that inflation effect needs to start at commencement. That's the issue. So it's really, the way to view this is as a price-based incentive, and it's a commercial deal, and ultimately the resolution of that will be on close. So that's what that means. And the final one of substance here is that what we call deep water user election. Oh, sorry, I should say we've got force majeure events, that's pretty self-explanatory, and delivery failure, which lasts for a full year. And that's really realistic only under a force majeure scenario. So probably the ones that need a wee bit more discussion, the FEMP and also the deep water election. I think those are the ones that are the key ones. Okay, so the FEMP clause is effectively, the first point here is that clearly, because we've got a final decision from a board of inquiry that's under appeal, we and no other party knows absolutely what terms and conditions may prevail, assuming the appeal is resolved. In terms of the plan change, and particularly this is the plan change of the consent conditions prevailing. So effectively any water use agreement signed at this point has that level of conditionality in it for obvious reasons. The second point though is drilling down into a level of detail, and this makes the assumption that broadly speaking the existing terms and conditions and consent conditions and plan change framework survives the appeal process as it is today. Then what we are doing is some quite detailed work inside the scheme around nutrient modelling, but equally we need HBRC as the regulator to determine its protocol around the application of land use capability classifications and how the whole overseer modelling scenario fits with that. So that's a regulator's issue, it's not our issue. That sits firmly with HBRC, but from the scheme's perspective we need to know how that protocol is applied. So that's a point of conditionality because it materially affects what might not happen. In terms of nutrient budgets, what we're doing there, using the current Board of Inquiry final decision, is we're doing a very detailed exercise right across the entire scheme footprint around leaching rates, nitrogen leaching rates, land use capability classes, and in effect looking at how the representative farming types fit into that framework. So and we're doing that both at an entire scheme level, but we're also doing specific case studies around that, which enable us in turn to aggregate that information back into an individual commercial negotiation. Just the third bullet there, initial mapping. So we're clearly cognizant of nitrogen thresholds within the water body, subcatchments and streams as it is today. And we've identified two subcatchments, Kahukuri, which if you want to know roughly geographically where is that, well the township of Onga fits into the Kahukuri. There's a couple of other farming systems that fit into it. The actual area affected in terms of stream is relatively narrow, it's a small window, but the reality is the nitrogen levels in stream are around about 60% of the current the current limit. Okay, so that's an area that's just put up a flag that we need to go through a process and look at that carefully. And similarly, the same issue prevails for the Papanui area. So what we're doing there is keeping an eye on that. In turn, as we get water uptake, WA sign we'll be able to model into those areas and across the scheme itself where those farming types fit in terms of their ability to sit inside the regulatory framework. So that's a piece of work that's going. It's moving quite fast, it's fair to say, and we're pretty close. I think by the end of this month, end of October, we will be in a position to pretty much have the entire footprint sorted in that regard. So coming back to if, for example, we do have areas where we think the limit's going to be is at risk, and the trigger is that the nitrogen level in stream is 80% of the limit, then that triggers a process under the consent of mitigation management options and a whole bunch of management interventions, basically. So that's an area that we just have to work our way through in terms of the actuality of water uptake. Okay, so process steps. Water users have 12 months, but the point here, following the financial close, to submit a draft FEMP noting that it's a 3-year build period. But equally, that obligation doesn't go away, and if a water user who signed a water user agreement, in effect, hasn't undertaken that task, then the scheme itself can continue to charge the normal obligations under the water user agreement, regardless of whether they've done it or not. So there's a process point around that. And if, for example, on what we think, providing the current consent conditions prevail, and plan change prevails, there may be the odd case where there's a farming enterprise that can't meet those conditions. They'll have had to go through a process, will have had to go through a process, and will have ultimately had to jointly agree that land use activity can't prevail or operate within the regulatory framework. So there's a process around it. So hopefully that's clear, but quite a bit of underlying technical work.
Why don't you stop there for questions about that piece?
Councillor Belford.
So I do have some questions around that. If the way I understand this now, if someone were contemplating signing a water user agreement, one of the conversations they would have with you guys is, here's what we might do if we had access to additional water. Based on this analysis that you all are doing, you might have a view as to whether what they contemplate is going to be feasible within the limits that will exist under the final decision. Is that basically sort of
broadly speaking, yes.
Conversation that happens? And this particular provision that if parties cannot procure and approve FEMP, that will continue to exist in the basic contract in perpetuity. I mean, after you're waiting for a decision from the High Court.
Well, no, actually, it may well not.
Can you clarify that?
But the point is, it sits there in the water user agreement as it sits today. But there's a key point, and this will be a point of review by the HBRIC board in the first instance. And once we have a clarity around the uptake profile, we have clarity around existing water user agreements and the land use activity types and how they're layered over the landscape, there'll be a review process that management effectively will bring to the board of HBRIC and with the question, do we need that FEMP and that process embedded in the water use agreement or not? Because I can pretty much tell you now there's a number of land uses that are no issue whatsoever. But it's the actuality of the water uptake and the land use conversion process that will drive whether or not it becomes an issue for us. And so take a theoretical situation. We might have a subcatchment. That subcatchment might have a significant proportion of land use capability class 5 or 6 in it, which tends to be lighter soils, lighter stony soils. And it may be, and it may well be the case that if there was a dairy predominance in the land use type triggered for that particular subcatchment, then there'd be a limit as to how much dairy can go into it. But the point is that we have to be able to see that profile in actuality, and we have to take that to HBRIC. So I think it's fair to say, Chairman, that we've simply said we need to build the actual picture, we need to test that actual picture, and ultimately whether that clause in its entirety or in part or can be moved out of the water use agreement at financial close is something that we'll be keeping an eye on and bring a proposition to the board on. Really?
I think I'd say that I think it's very unlikely that this conditionality would remain in perpetuity. Once you've got through the first 12 months and people have got an approved farm environmental management plan, it's my belief that the agreement is constructed in a way where that's kind of a one-time opportunity, to get out. Once you're approved, you're in, and you have a confirmed agreement. But there will be some people who, for the reasons that Andrew has talked about, it might not be possible for them to get an approved farm environmental management plan. It might be that they're the last person in to sign up in a particular catchment where the nutrient levels are already quite high, and they want to do a high leaching arrangement, and theirs would take the scheme over the 80% of the limits, and so our view then would be we don't want to sign a contract with them, and so they have to have the ability to get out.
So, if I may, just to follow up to that, if the scheme has presumed a fair amount of land turnover, ownership change, so if somebody went through this process to your satisfaction on day one, signed their agreement and so forth, 5 years down the road, let's say, sells their property, how does that agreement roll over? That and they come along thinking, you were doing X, I want to do Y because I think I can make more money doing Y. Do they have to trigger this process again, come in with a new FEMP? How does that work?
My understanding of how that will work is that, so first of all, it is the limited partnership that has to meet the land use conditions for the scheme as a whole, for every individual, aggregated up. That's how it's structured in the conditions and in the consents. So part of the due diligence of a purchaser in 5 or 10 or 15 or 30 years' time for our particular property in our particular place, they would have to ascertain, I imagine, whether or not they can do the development, the further development that they might want to do, and they would have to have a negotiation with the Ruataniwha Water Limited Partnership about their ability to intensify, change land use, and so on and so forth. And I guess that would they would have to satisfy themselves that they're able to do what they want to do within the overall constraints that the scheme is permitted to manage under. And that will vary from place to place, because some catchments are nearer, even now, to the 2.4 milligram per litre nitrogen limit than others are. And the overall land use conditions include that the scheme as a whole can't exceed 80% of that limit without requiring, at a sub-catchment level, as well as the whole scheme, without then going back to all of the existing users within that sub-catchment and requiring them to remodel their current outputs and to revise and change their farm environmental management plans and their practices so that when those practices are put into the model says we will be under 80%. So if somebody came along and said, I want to do X in this particular place, that would undoubtedly wind up being tested by the limited partnership because they don't want to breach their conditions.
So just to,
That's supplementary, isn't it?
yeah, just to follow up to that, Andy, so if you have one of these such sub-catchments which is approaching the 80% trigger level, and the only way that the limited partnership can see to keep the level below that, at or below that, is to, let's say, reduce the level of leaching that's allowable on the LUC, and that needs to apply across the catchment, and when the users draw up their revised FEMP, they can't make it work. Is that a trigger under this agreement that allows them to exit?
I don't believe so.
No, it's not. It's not.
So what happens? They're allowed to continue to leach at that level, which pushes the waterways above.
Well, the point is the constraint, I think, Councillor, the constraint sits with the scheme. So the scheme's got to keep a pretty close eye on it. In a scenario where you've got the scenario you described, you're approaching the 80%. If the scheme's contracting more water in that particular subcatchment, and it's going to have a view on that land use, the impact of that land use on that in-stream situation, and the actual constraint is not so much the existing water user agreements, any future water user agreements and land use conversion in that area. That's the constraint. That's the bit that the scheme has to manage.